So in this tutorial, we're going to have a look at how to create a version of this famous Las Vegas sign. And this is kind of a beginner level tutorial where we're looking at really common used tools for modeling in Cinema 4D, things like extrudes and sweeps. And we're going to use a couple of other things like a MoGraph cloner to make some light bulbs. And we're just going to make a really simple version of this sign just to see how some of these tools work. So let's get started and we'll work on this main part of the sign here for a starter. So in Cinema 4D, I'm going to start off by extruding the main part of the sign. I'm going to go to my Create menu, create a spline, and we have a spline called a four-sided spline, and this creates a diamond-shaped spline. It's flying all over the screen. And we're going to extrude this to create the initial part of the spline. So if we go to our Create menu and go to Generators, we can grab an extrude and drag and drop our four-sided spline into the extrude. And this is going to be the base for this sign. Now, as I said, this is just a rough version of this Las Vegas sign. I'm just going to use this diamond shape. The original one has these sort of curved edges on it. If you want to, you could get into Illustrator and draw yourself some nice curved corners and create whatever shapes you need here, but I'm just going to do this very simply all in Cinema 4D. Okay, so once I've created my extrude, if I select the extrude, we've got these movement options here. These control the direction the extrude goes in, and I just want mine to go backwards in this Z-axis. So I've got some depth now for this sign. And let's make that fairly small for a starter. Okay, now another thing I want to do, if I look back at this reference image, is there is a slightly raised edge around the outside of the sign. So I'm going to use a tool called a sweep to create something similar to this. Now a sweep works on two splines, on a shape spline and then a cross-section spline. But what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to take this four-sided spline that I've created here, I'm going to duplicate it. So there's a couple of ways to duplicate. I can hit Command-C, Command-V, and that'll copy and paste it in there. That's probably the easiest way. You can also Command-Drag, and oops, have them both selected, and so we've got more copies of them there. So a couple of different ways to copy stuff. Here's my my four-sided curve here, and now what I want is a cross-sectional shape that's going to be a little raised, a little bit larger than this, the thickness of this base of the sign. I'll just start off by just using something really simple like a rectangle, and this rectangle needs to be fairly small to go around the edge of this. So I'm just going to pull the size of this down to something like 10 units, and I'll set up my sweep, and then I'll adjust the size of this. So let's go to the Create menu, go to Generators and make a sweep, and let's put these two shapes into the sweep. I've just shift selected them, drag and drop them into the sweep, and now I've got that square shape as being swept around the profile of that diamond shape. Now, the great thing about this is I can go back to this initial rectangle here, and I can change the size of it, make it a little smaller if I want. And I can grab this sweep itself, get my move tool, and just shift it backwards a little bit if I want. And I can just play around with these settings until I get something that I like. And I want this to just stick out a little bit there. So now I've got this edge around here. Now you can do all sorts of clever things with a sweep. I've just used a simple rectangle shape. What I could do if I wanted to be really clever, if I wanted a bit more detail, I could draw a cross-sectional shape, or I could even use a font, for example. So if I go to my Create menu, go to Splines and create text. This is really big. I could use something like the plus symbol on my keyboard. And maybe if I found a really thick, chunky, bold font, something like maybe Impact, which is a really heavy font. If I can find that in my list. And if I made that, I don't have a bold option, but that's a little bit thicker. I could even, let's just make this smaller. I could even put something like that into the sweep. Take this one out, and I'd end up with this plus shape being swept around, so I'd get even more detail. So there's all sorts of things that you can do to add detail into your sweeps by using different shaped curves, splines, fonts, whatever. I'm just going to leave this plain as it was before. Let's delete that text. So I've got a little bit of an outline on my sign now. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to have a look at creating the text in the center of my sign. Now, what I'm going to do is actually create text as splines and then extrude it so it just sits out slightly and comes out as 3D text. So let's create a whole bunch of text splines. So create spline text, and this is going to be 2. Now I'll just check my fonts here. Now if I go back to my reference image, the welcome, this is made up of a whole bunch of different bits of geometry, so I'm just making this 2 Fabulous Las Vegas, Nevada sign part here. So there's my 2. That's quite a light sans serif font. That'll do for now, but it's really big. The other thing is I'm just going to center this text. Oops, wrong one. Middle centered. Make it smaller. Let's get a little bit closer there so we can see this. Just going to move it outwards on this blue z-axis, just forwards a little bit, so that I can see what's going on here. Now just notice something really odd's happening with my sign there. It's on a little bit of an angle. I think at some point I must have accidentally rotated that. So if I select that 4-sided spline and go to its coordinates, and yes, I did, I accidentally rotated a little bit. Let's just set that back to 0. And I must have done the same with this one because it was a duplicate of the other 4-sided spline. Let's just set that back to 0, much better. There we go. Okay, so back to our text. Here's the 2 text, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put this roughly in position to start with, and once I've got the rest of my text created, I'm going to size it and position it and get it working properly. So 2, the next bit I need is a Fabulous Las Vegas, Nevada. So create spline text. This will be Fabulous. I'm going to center it to the middle. Going to make the size a lot smaller. And I want some kind of scripty font, so let's see what I've got in here. I'm pretty sure I might have a couple of flowing script type fonts. Don't know what that is, but that looks interesting. Maybe a little thin, but that's not bad. Snell Roundhand. What else have I got in here? Let's have a look. That one's pretty good. Sign Painter. That's sort of starting to get a little bit close to it. Not far off. Now, I'm not too worried if this isn't exactly correct, but I want to get it about something kind of similar. Now, I've got a feeling somewhere back through here, I've got in the B's somewhere. Maybe I haven't. Nope, can't find the one I'm after. Oh, maybe this is it. That's the one, I think. Brush script. Let's stick with that one. Okay, so that needs to be a little larger. I think. Fabulous. Let's just keep making these, and I'll size them and position them once I'm done. Text Fabulous. We want the Las Vegas in capitals. And again, I want this. I keep clicking this wrong button here. I'm a bit clumsy today. There's the big Las Vegas. And what kind of font is that? That's a pretty solid sans serif capitals type of font. Let's make that a little smaller. And something a bit more interesting than that. Let's see what else I've got in here. That's quite a heavy font. It's not really like the one in the sign, but I'm just going to stick with this just while we build up this process of making the sign and putting it together. And then Nevada, we've got a small font that could almost be the same as the main body one. So what I might just do is command drag this downwards, which we just duplicated. And now I can just change the text, Nevada. And let's make the size of this a lot smaller. And got a slightly lighter version of that. And I might space that out a little as well. Okay, so now a smart thing to do here would be to label, so to name these splines that I've created. So this one is Nevada. This one is Las Vegas. This one is Fabulous. And this one is Two. It's always a good idea to name your objects because you can end up with a lot of them in the scene, and can get pretty confusing if you don't know what you're looking for and everything has the same name. Okay, so let's just do a little bit of work on repositioning some of these. Now the reason why I've created these as different splines, firstly because they're different typefaces, so I want to use different typefaces on these different parts of it. Also, if we look at the original image, there's a couple of different colors on here, so I want to be able to place a different colored material on some of these different bits of text. So that's looking not too bad. As I said, it's not exactly what's on the sign, but I want to get this, you know, something similar. So let's just shift all those down a little bit. I've got to put the welcome across the top, so I've got to make sure that this is all going to fit okay in there. Okay, that's going to do for now. And what I want to do now is I want to extrude these into different objects. As I said, some of these have got different colors. The Las Vegas is one color, it needs one material. The Too Fabulous Nevada, that needs a different material. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect these three bits of text together, the Too Fabulous Nevada. I'll connect those together and extrude them. And the Las Vegas, I'll extrude on its own. So first things first, let's extrude this Las Vegas text. Let's go to our Create menu, go to Generators, and make an extrude. And let's find the Las Vegas text. There it is there. Drag and drop it onto the extrude. And let's grab this extrude and just move it forwards on this Z-axis, this blue arrow. And now we've got some text just sitting out from our sign a little bit. I'm just going to have this not too sticking out too far, just a little. Okay, so these other bits of text, I want to extrude these all together. I could create an extrude for each single one of those, but I could also just connect these together and extrude them one at a time. So let's go to our Create menu. Let's go to Generators and grab a Connect. And what I'm going to do is grab these three bits of text spline that I've got, drag and drop them into the Connect, so they're now treated like one object. Now I can extrude that Connect. So let's go Create, Generator, Extrude, and if I drag and drop my Connect in there, now I should have, there's my bits of text. They're not all at the same depth in 3D space though. If I grab that extrude and just move it forwards, there's a little bit of variation there. So if I grab my 2 spline and just check its coordinates, in the Z-axis it's at -5, this one is at 0, this one is at 0. Let's put this back to 0, and that's just shifted them all into the same depth there. Now, if I look at the extrude, I don't need my text to be this deep. So let's go back to the extrude and go to its object tab, and I can just turn that down. And now I can grab the extrude and pull it along that blue Z-axis and have it just sitting out a little bit. And there's our text made. Now, this is all gray at the moment. There's just all default materials on here. So what I'm going to quickly do is just create a couple of colored materials, really simple, so that I can just see this a little bit easier as I work. So down in my materials area, I'm going to create a new default material. If I double click this, I can get to all its attributes. I've got its color and transparency and bump and all sorts of other things. I'm just going to give this a really simple color and apply it to some of the text we've got. So if I select the color tab here, and I'm going to grab this sort of bluish kind of color. So in the color section, I've got HSV color selection mode, so you can pick colors that way if you want to. If you're a little more familiar with using RGB values, you can change to RGB, and let's give that some blue and slightly lighter blue, or maybe a little too light. Let's bring that back a bit, and there's our blue, and I'll call this material blue. Because again, you'll get many materials in your scene as you work. It's a good idea to name them as you go. So let's drag and drop this onto our text, the extrude, and all of this goes that blue color. Now I should really start labeling these a little better. So let's call this text 2, and let's call this extrude here text 1 Las Vegas, just so I know which one is which, and it helps if you spell correctly. Okay, so let's get some red kind of color going on for the main part of the Las Vegas sign. So here's a material that I've got already made. I'm just going to hold down the Command key and drag it across, and now I've got a copy of that. I'm going to double click it to edit it, and let's call this red, and just go to the color channel here, and let's pull the red up and get ourselves a slightly orangey kind of red. And let's drop that onto this Las Vegas extrude. Okay, so now that we've got some colors in our scene, it just makes things a little easier to see as we're working. Next step, we're going to create some light bulbs around the edge of our sign. Now, again, because this is a very simple introductory kind of modeling tutorial, I'm just going to use spheres for my light bulb. So let's create an initial sphere. Create sphere, primitive sphere. That's a little big. Let's just make this smaller. So with all these primitives in Cinema 4D, they should have little lines with a tiny little dot on them. If you click and drag those, you can adjust the creation parameters. And let's create a cloner now so that we can duplicate our light bulb. So MoGraph, cloner. And we also need something to clone onto. So once again, I'm going to use this four-sided shape which makes up the outline of our sign. I'm going to duplicate it and make one that's slightly bigger that sits outside the sign. So here it is here, Control-C, Control-V, and now I've got one of these up the top of my, on the top of my object list. And what I'm going to do is just increase the size of it until I can see it sort of peeking out around the sign there. And I want to try and keep this gap or this spacing the same all the way around. So I'm just going to use my eye to check this out and see if I can get that looking about right. So this is the curve that I'm going to copy my light bulb spheres onto using the cloner. Okay, so here's my cloner. I want to clone that sphere, that little light bulb. So I'm going to put the sphere into the cloner, drag and drop it in there. And what we get when we do that is 3 spheres sitting on top of each other. So the default setting for a cloner is to make 3 copies of whatever that thing is and to shift them upwards in the y-axis. So this is what we call a linear array of clones. It's a line of clones. I don't want that. I want to clone my objects onto this diamond-shaped path I've got going around my sign. So let's select the cloner. Under the mode, I want to change it to object mode, which means we can spread one object across the surface of another object. In this case, we're going to use this four-sided line. So to do that, let's go back to our cloner. We're using an object cloner. There's a field down here that says object. It's currently blank. This is what we're going to clone onto. So what I want to do is grab that four-sided spline that I've created, and with one movement, one click and drag and drop, I'm going to drop it into this field here. So if I go click and drag and then drop, and now what we should have that we can see is these clones, these spheres that have been copied around the object. Now we want more than this. If we look back at the picture, we've got lots of little lights. Here I've got a couple of big ones. So what I want to do is go to my cloner, have a look at this count section, and that's how many of these clones there are. So I can just turn that up to whatever I want. Now probably if you use something like a even number, you'll probably get the clones, these light bulb clones, distributed nice and cleanly around your sign. If you use odd numbers, maybe they won't meet up exactly on the points or the edges. So just keep an eye on the count and make sure you've got an appropriate number of light bulbs cloned onto your billboard. Looks pretty good. Next thing I'm going to do, I want these to sit a little bit further back in the sign. Now these spheres have been cloned onto this curve, so I should be able to grab that curve and just shift it backwards a little bit. And now I've got them sitting around there a little better. Now, looking at that, maybe I want my light bulbs a little smaller, so I can go to the sphere which has been cloned and its radius. I can just turn those down a little bit if I want to, somewhere around 2 centimeters for me, maybe a little bit less. Okay, that's great. And if these aren't sitting far enough away from the sign, or if they're sitting too close, I can go back to my four-sided shape and I can change the settings on that. The size of that will control how far away the light bulbs are from the sign. Okay, so this is looking pretty good. What have we got next? We've got the welcome to make and this base with the stars on it. Now, before I get too much further, I might group all of these elements together so that they're easy to control and move around. So let's just close all of these hierarchies. And what I'm going to do is select them all. And I'm going to create a new null, create a null. This will create a null, or that can be used as an empty group at the origin. And I'm going to click and drag all these objects so far and drop them into the null. So if I want to shift this sign around, I just grab that null, move it around, and everything comes with it. So that's a really good habit to get into, is grouping objects together. It gives you a little more control over them. The other thing I'm going to do here is rename that null. Just double click and I'll call this the sign. And this is looking pretty good. So the next thing I'm going to have a look at making is the welcome letters. So these are made up of a sort of a cylindrical base. There's this neon ring around it, sort of a torus, a donut type shape, and then there's this little thin font inside it. I'm not going to try and be clever and make all the little details of the neon signs. I'm just going to make some circular donut shapes and build them together into the sign. So I will do that in the next section.